Good morning. My name is Dr. Joe Wysocki. I'm the Dean of the Honors College here, and welcome to the Conversatio podcast, the podcast of Belmont Abbey College. Today, I am absolutely delighted to be joined by my friend, Dr. Anika Prather, who was with us, 2 years ago, I think now, in the midst of COVID. She was our virtual speaker for a Jack Miller conference, but so wonderful to have her back, and we're going to have a great conversation. In the way of a brief introduction, Dr. Anika Prather earned her bachelor's degree from Howard University in elementary education. She also has earned several graduate degrees in education from New York University and Howard University. She has a master's in liberal arts from St. John's College in Annapolis and a PhD in English, theater, and literacy education from the University of Maryland. Her research is on building literacy with African American students through engagement in the books of the canon, and self-published her book, Living in the Constellation of the Canon, The Lived Experiences of African American Students Reading Great Books Literature. She's also co-author for The Black Intellectual Tradition with Dr. Angel Parham. She has served as a teacher, supervisor for student teachers, director of education, and head of school. Currently, she's a sought-after speaker on the topic of the relevancy of classical studies to the Black community. She teaches in the English department at Howard University, serves as director of high-quality curriculum instruction at Johns Hopkins University, and is founder of the Living Water School located in Southern Maryland. The Living Water School is a unique Christian school for independent learners based on the educational philosophies of classical education and the Sudbury model. In the spring of 2022, Anika and her husband Damon opened the Living Water Center, where activities for the Living Water School, book talks, and other events are hosted. Dr. Prather is married to Damon Prather, an engineer, and has an MBA from Wisconsin-Madison. Dr. Prather and I serve on a couple of boards together, but we usually just get to see each other in the context of these meetings, and so it's wonderful to have you back for a conversation. I just want to begin with just sort of asking you to tell us a little bit about your journey to all of that work that I've just laid out in terms of the Black intellectual tradition and great books, and tell us a bit about yourself.
My journey started through my parents. I feel like everyone knows my parents, even though a lot of people have not met them personally because I talked about them so much. They're so inspirational in this journey. Growing up, they wouldn't have called it classical education. I don't think they realized that's what they were doing. My brother and I both went to Christian schools, but at home, they would extend that education to us just reading all types of literature, especially various works of the canon. And a favorite of our family would be Tolkien or C.S. Lewis, but many others. Shakespeare. I grew up just doing all of these great works and authors, and also ancient and theologians as well. My father was really big on me just having access to that, and they just fed us this. And growing up, I didn't realize this is what they were giving me until I started my dissertation, that's what they had done. And so fast forward from my growing up years, when I was in grad school at NYU, they decided to start a classical school in a predominantly Black and low income neighborhood here in PG County. And forgetting that upbringing, I thought, what are you doing? Like, this literature is irrelevant to our people. And it's so interesting that I felt that way because, every house I grew up in, I remember my mom, when we would look, I lived in like 2 different houses. And every time we moved, my mom would look for where she could put a library or if the house had a library already. The library was the center of our family. And it's always been massive. And it always was unsegregated. It was just, I might have a Bible next to the Book of Mormon, Malcolm X next to Shakespeare, Angela Davis next to Watchman Nee, and they just had this massive library that I grew up paying attention to. I would pull books off and kind of read through things and learn for myself. And so it made sense as I started my research on my dissertation about the relevancy of this. It made sense that my parents would eventually want to start a school. And so they chose classical education because they were at a Christian conference. We all were at a retreat center. And they just saw this little pamphlet from the Association of Classical Christian Schools that said how to start a classical school, something like that. My mom took it's a little rectangle pamphlet, and she and my dad read it that whole week we're at the conference. They got home from the conference and contacted ACCS. ACCS sent them everything they needed. And my mom and dad ran that school for 10 years. I was a public school teacher by the time I finally started, working full time in Montgomery County Public Schools here in Maryland. And, after a while, my mom just kept asking me, could you please come help us? Can you help us? We'll help you. I know it's a pay cut. We'll help you with any bills that you have. If you could just help us, we need your background to help us. And long story short, I did. I left public school, took a leap of faith. It was a very hard decision, but probably the best decision. That's where I found my purpose. And I came in as the performing arts teacher, teaching music and drama, because that was my background. And then eventually took on the Great Books class, where I would incorporate music and drama into the Great Books class, where the students would read various works of the canon, and then we would end the year creating an original production written by students that captured all the various themes we discussed during the year. And so it was a really powerful experience. And I did that for about 6 years, up until the school closed down, and thought I was done with that world. My children were toddlers, ages 3 and under, and putting them in school wasn't really at the forefront of my mind. They were staying with my mom while I was at work. I was a principal then. And it came time for my oldest son to start kindergarten. And I realized that, I'm not going to be able to homeschool. Where will I put him? Because he has to have a classical education. He has to have this education that I grew up having, even though I didn't realize that's what I was having. And the work we did together with my parents, I wanted him to have that. And so then I did a search, just trying, starting a school. No one in their right mind would start out saying, I want to start a school. It's anyone who says that is either very prideful or insane. So I did not want to start a school. I had no desire to be a leader of a school. My favorite job has been being a kindergarten teacher. That I could have done that till retirement, but that God had other plans. But I realized that there was nothing for my son, who was African American, to have a classical education that also celebrated his heritage and created a connection to his heritage. So I started the Living Water School almost 9 years ago, and it is still running. It goes from K to 12th grade, and we just got a building. We rent it, but it's our first building. We're not renting from a church. We're not renting classrooms from a church anymore. We have an actual building, and it's a hybrid. It's online for a lot of classes, and then we also meet in person during the week. And they get a classical education that is truly classical. I was trained in the Dorothy Sayers, the Trivium, a really more standardized approach to classical education with some color sprinkled in like pixie dust. And so it becomes this magical combination where they are learning about the classical tradition as well as how Black history connects to that tradition. Yeah.
Wonderful. I appreciate your remark about those trying to start schools are either prideful or insane. I'm on a board right now that is looking to found a classical school in Gaston County. I hope I fall into the insane rather than the prideful category, but absolutely. I don't think anybody goes, this sounds fun. They go, no, this is responding to a need that is deeply there. Yeah.
Yep. That's exactly it.
Well, great.
Yes.
I just want to pick up on some of your remarks about your own story to talk a little bit. We have so much I could talk with you about, but we only have half an hour. This semester, I am teaching the senior year honors college course on education. It's a Great Books on Education course. And I loved what you said about your non-segregated bookshelf. In some ways, that's the way this course is. We begin with Plato and Aristotle on education. We do St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas, Locke, and Rousseau. And then we move on to some of Booker T. Washington's Up from Slavery, some of W.B. Du Bois, The Souls of Black Folk, and finally we end with St. John Henry Newman. And it's, I need
to steal that syllabus. I need to steal that syllabus. Yeah, oh my goodness.
Yeah, it is. It's the first time I've taught it. I've taught some of these texts before, but so excited to do it. But I wanted to talk with you in thinking about, as you mentioned, the Living Water School, incorporating the great books, the great tradition, thinking about freedom and an education for freedom, and thinking about that in terms of the Black intellectual tradition, and looking at these two authors who obviously, that is Washington and Du Bois, who are so important for the Black intellectual tradition, but I think are really universal. They raise these universal questions for us as Americans, especially those of us who are citizens in modern liberal democracies. How do we engage? How do we engage with the great books? But what type of education really is the most necessary, and what should our education look like? So before we maybe get into maybe some of the interesting debate and controversy, and how much of a controversy is there, or conflict between Washington and Du Bois, could you give us just a little background about these authors, maybe beginning with Washington, since he came first?
Yep. And as I talk about them, I'm going to end talking about where I stand with both of them too, and how I see their relevance. Although, as you know, Du Bois is my boyfriend, so I'm partial to Du Bois. All right.
Well, but by arguing for Washington, even though that I'm not sure where I stand on all of it. So go ahead.
So Booker T. Washington, his book Up from Slavery is really important to really understanding where he stood, number one, with classical education. So I'm going to start off by saying this. He himself was classically educated, and he himself valued the canon. Yeah. But he was of the mindset that to speed up progress, we shouldn't do classical education in the broad scape of things in the Black community. He felt a quicker way to progress, safety, and self-preservation was to accept your space in the world until these things naturally work itself out. And which is kind of troublesome to me, because as you read his autobiography and other speeches, you recognize his brilliance and how somehow he didn't quite see why it was important to pass his educational experience on to his people in the way that he received it. I often wondered, look at what it did for you. You came up from slavery as a result of this type of education. One of the first things he does, he's been out of slavery just not that long. Maybe he might be in his late teens, early 20s. And I believe he's working at Hampton. Yeah. At the time, he's working his way through Hampton. And the first thing he does is build himself a bookshelf. That's one of the first things he does with his true freedom, is build himself a bookshelf where he would read different books. He favored autobiographies. He was a very intellectual, learned man. This is why he could speak the way he did. He could understand politics the way he did. This is why he could successfully start and run a university that is still in existence today. I mean, if you look at how Tuskegee became very self-sustaining, it came to the point where even though he was getting funding from different people, mostly from white Southerners, and as he said, some of his closest friends fought in the Confederacy, which when I read that, I had to pray. But, and so he did receive funding from them, but he wasn't 100% dependent on that. What he did is he trained every student of Tuskegee in a trade. And so the students built the buildings. Right. The students prepared the food. The farming, the food came from their own farm. It was a self-sustaining institution. This is why Tuskegee was so successful. And when we say trades, I also want to define trades. So this is where you do see him kind of sneak in intellectual strength, is that when we think trades, it wasn't just training in how to be a plumber or how to build a building or how to be a good maintenance person. Not that kind of it. I mean, that was part of it, but they were architects, they were veterinarians, they were pilots, they were scientists. A lot of research that is done was done early back then in medicine was done through Tuskegee. Also, but sometimes he would sacrifice his own people to do that research. That's a whole nother story. And so my point is that he really genuinely loved his people. We know that. That is unmistakable in anything he wrote. And I feel that love for his people was almost like a father over his children. Like he feared for our safety. He feared for our well-being. And so I'm saying that to say that I've had to learn, and my father had to really help me with this because I really struggled with Booker T. Washington, is that he was from the South. He was enslaved. He was constantly under death threats. At one point, some white supremacist group had put literally a contract out on his life for him to be killed.
Right.
And so he is dealing with all of that pressure. Like many of us would crack under just someone not, being unkind to us. But he was literally, he had children, he had a wife, he had these people he was responsible for educating. All of that was constantly in danger of some type of brutal, murderous attack. And he lived with that fear. And so what Booker T. Washington chose to do was to go a safer route. And he did that to preserve the work he was doing and also to preserve his life. And we can't fault him for that. And so when he recognized that white people of that time became very angry when Black people got a really good education, to the point they would lynch people if they thought they were smarter than them, just for looking like they might think they are smarter than them. So he said, accept your place. Don't get involved in politics, because he was afraid with this fight for the right to vote. So many people were being killed and lynched over that. He's like, don't do that. Just, continue to work in the skills and trades you're learning here at Tuskegee, so that you can gain at least the acceptance and respect of whites, because you're fulfilling a need that they have. You can be able to earn an income that provides for your family. And his thinking actually was instrumental in helping Black families, Black communities rise out of poverty. And they were pouring back into the economic structure of the nation. Although even though they were paying their taxes, they couldn't go in certain places because of Jim Crow. So the very things that they were paying, like, the very taxes they were paying to support various parts of their community, they couldn't be in those spaces. But Booker T. Washington said, be safe, preserve yourself, accept your place. And then his mentality began to go into the education of America. He began to really partner with the country's Board of Education, Department of Education, and that effort. And this is why Du Bois was fighting him constantly. And in essence, Booker T actually won the fight. We see that the effects of that even now. This is why the classical renewal movement is fighting so hard. Some are fighting it for wrong reasons, and we know that. But there are some who genuinely feel like this is the best education for all free people. And we're fighting a battle because Booker T. Washington, along with the Department of Education of the United States, began to close down the classical curricula that was being taught in segregated schools. And so segregated schools began to bring in industrial education. Anna Julia Cooper also tried to fight against this. And I know we're not talking about her, but just kind of dropping that little nugget there. And, when she refused, she was the principal of the M Street School, but this is important to understand this connection with Booker T. Washington. And she had a completely classical curriculum in that school in DC. She's the first Black principal of a public school in DC, M Street School. And she had the students speaking, writing, reading Latin fluently. They were reading all of the classics. They were learning rhetoric and logic. And these students would graduate and go to some of the top universities in the nation. They were sometimes the first Black person at this or that university. And Booker T. Washington and the Department of Education closed that down. They wanted her to stop. She refused to stop. And she lost her job. She was fired. And the other Black teachers of that school, one of and that were kind of in that community, one of them being Mary Church Terrell, instead of supporting Anna Julia Cooper's vision for why classical education is so important for every free man, they sided with Booker T. Washington, because Booker T. Washington at the time was probably the most powerful Black man in America. And Booker T. Washington had a relationship with America's leadership. And many people wanted to protect their status by not going against this powerful Black man. And so people like Du Bois, who ended up living in exile in Ghana, and Anna Julia Cooper, who ended up losing her job, they were outcasts.
Yeah.
You know? And so Booker T. Washington's philosophy of industrial education was, first of all, introduced into segregated schools. And eventually, the sad part about it is then with desegregation, that mentality of industrial education just was for everyone. It came into everyone, because the mentality was, this is the best way for everyone to be educated. It's easier for everyone to just kind of find their place in America. And you began to educate for a job. You see, you know, the work that you and I do, we're not educating for a job. We're educating so we can do any job.
Yeah.
That we can accomplish anything. We're not educating for one specific career. Even teachers are taught now just how to teach. But I have a close friend who is a leader in a I'm not going to give any details, but she's a leader in a public school system. And she says her biggest struggle is most of her teachers don't like to read.
Yeah.
And so how do you come out of a teacher preparation program and you have to teach reading, but you don't like to read yourself? And so that's because even fields like teaching are taught in this industrialized way. Teach them how to sit still in their desk, how to have classroom management, how to take a test, how to fill in the blanks, how to turn in your paper and get an A. But where are we teaching them critical thinking? And that's something that, even though Booker T. Washington was trained in how to do that, or else how could he have been so successful? He did not pass that on to others. And so he chose another path for liberation and progress in America. And it included, and he says it in his autobiography, we don't need to know Latin. We don't need to sit around and just philosophize. I'm philosophize, I make that word up, but we don't need to just sit around and make up philosophy and talk about and think.
Yeah.
We have to work. We have to make money. We have to take care of ourselves. We have to do. And so that was his philosophy, even though he himself saw the value of classical education. I think he just felt that it wouldn't work.
Maybe if you would talk a little bit about Du Bois and his response, and then I want to ask some questions, because I want to, again, I'll try to maybe make the case a little for Booker T, and then you can, we can have a good conversation. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So Du Bois is, you almost kind of look at Booker. Booker's all the way. Now, when I say left and right, please, no one think I'm talking about politics. I'm not talking about that. If you think about Booker, he's all the way to the one side. I'll say that to be safe. Everything's so triggering these days.
Yeah.
When you talk about Booker T. Washington, he's all the way on one side. Okay. But now when you talk about Du Bois, and I'm going to talk about him honestly too, even though I love him.
Yeah.
Du Bois was all the way on the other side. His thinking was, if you teach us to think, we will be rich enough to have somebody do the work for us. And so you're not learning these skills of survival and trade, because I am a person who believes in trade schools, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And so he believed that you get the education, you learn the classics, you learn Latin. And now I get his passion for teaching Latin. I feel it. Like I'm possibly doing some consulting work with a school that wants to turn classical that's serving a Black community, and they were trying to figure out what classes to start with. I said, please start with Latin. Because what you begin to see with Latin, when Black students learn Latin, they almost immediately gain access to a literacy that they feel has been distanced from them. When you teach those Latin roots and English derivatives, they begin to understand anything anyone's saying, anything that's written.
Yeah.
They begin to spell better. They begin to write better, as opposed to this kind of rote way of learning English grammar. They learn the basis for it. And so by giving that to them through Latin, they become extremely liberated, and they become very happy because they know something about the world around them that they didn't know before. So Du Bois talks a lot about the importance of Latin.
Yeah.
He talks about the trivium and quadrivium, and recognizing that young people, especially illiterate people, and even the reason why we can take Du Bois's writings and connect it to K-12 education is because he's just on the ends of slavery, right? He was never enslaved himself, but he knew people who were enslaved. Obviously, he knew Booker T. Washington. And so he is speaking to Black people who were coming out of a state of illiteracy. So it's almost like educating a K-12 person, because they're starting over. They were not citizens before. They were considered farm animals, really, before. I mean, that literally they were considered the slave. Like a lot of times people talk about enslaved people as if they were seen as human. They were seen just like someone would see a cow. So they went from being seen as an animal in our society that is bred and forced to work on a farm to, oh, now you're a human being and you have this freedom and you have access to some rights. And so Du Bois was saying this type of education, this classical education, is going to be the easiest and quickest way and the most effective way to get them, as he calls it, above the veil, that darkness. So when I tell people introduce Latin right away, I want you to even describe this. I feel like there's a veil that's lifted. There's a darkness. See, when you're just in industrial education, you're just here. Anna Julia Cooper talks about you're just working to do the thing you've been doing for 400 years. Like, you're just there. When you give someone access to classical education, they are elevated beyond the working hand to the thinking person. And this thinking person can be instrumental in making a lot of the major decisions of our society. They can be the authors of the books that educate the next generation. And so that is what Du Bois was an advocate for. And so that's what all of his essays, just about everything he writes, a lot of people don't realize, just about everything he writes, even though he was, I think, one of the co-founders of the NAACP, he was really big on civil rights. They think his writing is just about his fight for liberation and equality. But his writings, I would say, I haven't read anything that's outside of this context. And that context is his writings. Yes, they're about civil rights and equality, of course. But his tool for that, or his process to gain that, was through classical education. Right. He felt that was the way to gain it. That is the way you find a seat at the table to make the decisions in our government. That is the way you find a place in academia to educate the next generation to rise above. That is the way you become that lawyer that can help overturn the laws that continue to discriminate against us. That was the way forward. Right. And why is classical education that important? And here's a fact that I know everyone knows, but it's a fact that we're arguing about and we cannot change. That classical, if it was another situation, we could have another discussion. But we cannot change history. We can learn from history. And what do we learn from history? Is that classical education is in the very DNA of America. And we got to process that for a minute. You can, like, I'm a human being. If you think about a living organism and they have DNA, and I think of America as a living, breathing thing. That's why we call her she, you know. It is, classical education is in her DNA. Now, someone's going to hear that and say, well, that means it's white supremacist. Classical education itself, as Aristotle understood it, as the ancients understood it, was not racist as we know it today. It was known oftentimes as being elitist, but it wasn't known to be racist. And honestly, all types of people had access to it, whether they snuck it over through the centuries, since beginning of time, they would have access to this type of learning, right? And we see women, like we look at Sappho, the great poetess from ancient Greece. She somehow gained access to this type of learning and became one of the most well-respected poets of her time, even though women weren't typically educated. So that elevated her. So that's an example of the past. And so that type of powerful education, the education of Aristotle, or as I believe it's Du Bois or Anna Julia Cooper says, this was the education that was laid before there was even a pharaoh.
Right.
It's from the beginning. That education was what was brought to America and laid the foundation of this land. It's why we have Latin mottos. It's why we have fraternities and sororities. It's in our language. Our language is made up of so many Latin derivatives or Latin roots. And so when we say that's irrelevant to our people, we are plunging everyone into a state of illiteracy. And so Du Bois all of his essays are seeking to unpack that and help us understand that. And even though we understand this type of education was misused to support a white supremacist ideology, we know that it was a misuse. It wasn't its definition. If that makes sense. Some people think that because it was misused, racism defines classical education. And this is something that Black people understood. This is why I was reading something last night about Paul Laurence Dunbar's mother. He's this great poet. Well, his mother would sit and listen to her enslaver, the one who held her captive, read poetry to his children. And she would go back and share that with Paul. Yeah. And so he became this phenomenal poet who wrote the masterpiece, We Wear the Mask That Grins and Lies. I think it says something like it shields our face and hides our eyes, something like that. I'm trying to do it from memory. But he wrote this beautiful poem about what it's like to be in a society that sees you as inferior, and you have to kind of be behind this mask and smile. It grins and lies. It's, oh yes, okay, yeah, I'll accept my place. Right. But all the while you're hurting, because you know that your brown skin is not seen as equal. And so that Paul Laurence Dunbar was classically educated. Yeah. And if you look back at Dunbar, Toni Morrison, Zora Neale Hurston, Martin Luther King, Du Bois, Huey P. Newton, Angela Davis, every single Black person who has written or done anything of any influence in our history, fighting for our liberation and equality, you are going to find the classical tradition in their history. Yeah. And we can't do anything about that. I know we're upset. I know we wish it could be different, but you can't rewrite that narrative. It's already been written. So what do we do with it? We learn from it. What do we learn from it? Well, we learn, as Du Bois was trying to say in many of his writings, that it is our bridge. This is why he says, in that great opus to classical education, I sit with Shakespeare and he winces not. I walk arm in arm with Balzac and Dumas, and we glide in gilded halls. I summon Aristotle and what soul I will, and they all come graciously with no scorn nor condescension. So many people misunderstand him as being a communist or a person who was only about Black power, and he wasn't that. He really was thinking, that opus says it all, that classical education not only will help us progress, it will not only liberate us, but it will also connect us to those who at one time saw us as inferior. And maybe through this common knowledge that we have shared since the beginning of this country, some of us sneaking it, others having the rights to it because of their privilege, but we all have had it. And so it can connect all of us. It is our way forward. And so that's Du Bois. That's Booker T. Washington. Yeah. Where am I? I'm Anna Julia Cooper. She loved both of them. Yeah. And I see both of them are important. I think it is important for students, young people, to learn a trade, to learn how to do things with their
Yeah. Yeah.
hands and to take care of themselves. I tell my husband all the time, my husband is brilliant. He's a chemical engineer and a computer engineer. He's brilliant. But yes, he's also very literary. We love to talk about literature and write together. But the man can fix anything. And I said, oh, you are so fine. I just love that you're smart and can use your hands. And I feel like Anna Julia Cooper was saying that we can be successful at both. Let's do both. So all of her education involved both.
That's great. Yeah, I mean, you're sort of hitting on some of my question, and part of it I was wondering. My biggest intellectual influence tends to be Alexis de Tocqueville, and he, when I read The Souls of Black Folk for the first time, I found myself going, yes, right. I'm with you, and I didn't know Booker T. Washington's work, and so when in those those chapters where he's sort of arguing against what he's doing, I found it very sympathetic. Obviously, I are both part of the movement now, and so
yes,
we have a sort of interest where we're like, yeah, this is what I do, and he likes what I do, and so this is great.
Yeah.
But Tocqueville has this really interesting, challenging chapter that every once in a while I have to ask myself the question, like, am I wrong or am I missing something? And Tocqueville has this line, and I love him on everything else, but he, in a way, kind of takes the Booker T. Washington line, which he says, it's good for some people in democracies to have advanced studies in Greek and Latin, but not for most people. In fact, most people, if you go too far and you don't teach them how to work, they're going to be unhappy. They're going to be poor, and then they're going to be angry because they've learned all these things about justice and the highest good, and they don't have access to them. And so I guess my first question maybe would be, is there as much of a divide between the two as there is on the surface, or maybe as was seen at the time historically? And the reason I ask is, there's this speech by Booker T. Washington that he gives at a graduation, at a commencement at the Tuskegee School, where he's talking about cabbages, and he's talking about, I give you an education in cabbage and how to cultivate it, and you can eat, and it's practical. But there's also something you learn about nature, like that. Even this kind of education in the common work can be dignified, can lead us to wonder. And so it does both. And then, on the other hand, and maybe you can fill us in a little on this. I know there's that the piece by Du Bois on the talented 10th, So some would say, well, maybe, Du Bois is not for, how much liberal education does he want for everyone? And then does Booker T. Washington sort of open to more than, sometimes I think when we think of industrial education, you think of sort of soulless work on a what do you call it? A conveyor belt. Maybe there's something a little more there. So is there a way to sort of reconcile that?
It is. And I feel like, and this is not a plug for my school, but I really modeled it after Anna Julia Cooper's thinking. She was the president of a university called Frelinghuysen University. It's actually right around the corner. Like, her house is on one side of Howard University, and the building where Frelinghuysen University used to be is on the other side of Howard University. It's so interesting. And she believed, and she trained future teachers in the same mentality. So Nannie Helen Burroughs was one of her mentees. And Nannie Helen Burroughs, I think, was the first Black woman to start a school in the DC area. And the Nannie Helen Burroughs School believed in teaching classics and trades. Anna Julia Cooper believed at Frelinghuysen University, it was more so like the first community college for Black people in the DC area. One of the first. And it's named after a senator who tried to stand against Andrew Johnson, Senator Frelinghuysen. Yeah. Andrew Johnson was trying to end Reconstruction, and Frelinghuysen was trying to stand against him. So that's the university. And she felt in that school, she had adult students, of course. She was teaching them trades and classics, because her thinking was, you can do and think. You can do both at the same time. And you're right. At my school, the Living Water School, I push trade. I do push trade learn. I push trades. I push experiences and careers. And all of our students, before they graduate, they have to do an internship somewhere where they are doing. And I do that on purpose because in order to make sure those, but they all get a classical education because education is for that classical education is for everyone. I even believe it's for the child who may have special needs. It's for the bilingual, the student who doesn't speak English as a first language. It is liberating for everyone. But, and I think this is where Du Bois got himself in trouble with that talented 10. I'm like, why did my boyfriend have to write it like that? So he wrote it, but I don't think he meant it to say only a few can. I think he more so means only a few may be able to. There were so many obstacles in the way of our even intellectual progress. And so there were going to be so many things in the way. And that's why I said Du Bois was so all the way over here. He didn't really have an answer for those who weren't able to have access to this type of education. And I think he almost saw it as these are the ones who will lead us forward, and everyone else will kind of get lost. Booker T. Washington was like, well, what I have over here, everyone will be successful. For me, I feel if everyone has access to some form of classical learning, they learn to think for themselves, they learn to engage in the great questions of humanity. But then if they choose not to take it further, then they still have something to do with their hands, but yet they can sit down and enjoy a good book and discuss and talk and learn about the world around them, be open to all types of philosophies, and continue to build the soul of themselves. And so I think there has to be a marriage of the two.
Yeah. That's great. For me, I always, it seems that this may be an oversimplification, but I think of the liberal education part and its relationship to freedom as the liberal education helps us with self-knowledge, right? That's so important through reading the great books, through reading the classics. And Du Bois emphasizes that so much, right? We need these books that help us to understand human nature, the nature of God. No, it's always seemed to me that the sort of tension and the sort of dialogue between the two leads to a sort of vitality today in terms of all of those things that we need to be free people, right? And so the question of the best education for newly freed slaves is a question that we don't freedom is not just something that we can rely on even today, and that we don't need to work for, that we don't need to be educated for, and that the two things together really, right, that is liberal education, which helps us with self-knowledge and critical thinking.
Yes.
But then that education of taking care of your own stuff, the building of your own buildings. That's the most, I love that part of Booker T. Washington, right? Where, with young people, my own kids, right? Who they leave their stuff outside in the rain and they don't, right? And that idea of being a steward of your material things, right? And being able to not have a sort of throwaway culture, but one where you take care of those things. I feel like, that's that great thing that you get from Booker T. Washington, and maybe intellectually and historically, there's not an easy reconciliation, but I really appreciate what both of them have to offer.
Yes, and I'm so glad you said that. I want to use two examples of what we mean. Let's look at Henry David Thoreau when he wrote the book Walden, right? First of all, I think then he builds the cabin. So you see this, he's actually embodying what we're talking about. He is out there on Walden Pond, taking care of himself, working with his hands, but reading works of the canon and thinking critically. And from that experience comes this beautiful book that has blessed generations. I think Henry David Thoreau is an example of the marrying of the classical learning with the trade. He believed in working with his hands, and a good example of that. What we're saying right now. I'm kind of as you're talking, as you were just sharing, Joseph, is kind of making me realize something even about my own family. So I have tried to live that out, and now you're really giving it a framework for me. So my kids, they all have their own chores, they have things to do, but they also raise rabbits. I know that people think I'm crazy, like as if I don't need something else to do. But But what I've seen come from that responsibility, like I had to travel last weekend, but my kids made sure their rabbits were fed, their cages were clean, they had their water. They have bred rabbits. They have sold the baby rabbits to
Yeah.
people.
Mm-hmm.
And so there is, and that's kind of a practical example for anyone who's listening. But this is, we can't, I don't believe that we should just have kids sitting at a desk thinking all day. They need to do.
Yeah.
And so like even at my school, our students have to do chores at the end of a school day.
Yeah.
They have to clean the building. And I often get students who've never been made to clean. I've gotten students in the school. So when I ask them to do a chore, they don't know how to clean. At the school, they learn how to clean a toilet. They learn how to take care of and vacuum a space. I had a student, big young man, who didn't understand how to lift heavy things. Like we had to teach
Wow.
him, and now he knows how to carry furniture around and set it up. And so there's this ora et labora. Even though it means pray and work, I'm thinking about praying as thinking, meditating. But we've got to do both. We've got to be in our minds and in our bodies too. And I think together, married together, you really develop a whole human being.
That's great. It seems like the best classical schools are doing this, right? Like you see, it's not we're going to philosophize and only read Plato and never, right, get out there. That's great.
Yes.
Well, thank you.
Yes. George Washington Carver is another great example of that. Now he was more a Tuskegee type person, but he was definitely an intellectual,
Yeah.
And look at, but he was doing with his hands, and so I think there is more power in the both. And if you look at people throughout history, you see the doing and you see the thinking.
Yeah. Dr. Prather, there's so much more I want to talk with you about, and we'll have to do this again. I mean, I want to talk about the role. You mentioned ora et labora, and that comes from the Benedictine tradition of Belmont Abbey. We're Benedictine monks, and that's our, that's that Benedictine motto. And I would really love to, at some point, I want to get into the nitty gritty of like the politics, and I only mean not the partisan politics, but like, how do we move this forward? How do we how do we convince people of what we're trying to do?
And I'm nervous because as you and I have been talking, this type of education is so valuable to everyone, but as a representative of the Black community, it is so important. And I am nervous about the politics of it. There's a danger of turning it away. And I'm feeling the resistance in my community to this type of education is growing.
Oh, really?
And so I feel like the only way we're going to change that is if we really come together as a community and really allow us together to talk about this. I think it's still seen as, even if you have a school that is serving a diverse population, if the leadership and the founders are the ones pushing that, they're hiring the teachers, of course, it's still seen as colonization. It's still seen as white people trying to colonize. If there's still this resistance to us being able to connect our heritage with this tradition as if it's irrelevant or inferior, there's going to continue to be that resistance. This tradition has liberated many people, not just in the West, all over the world. And it's really important for us to unpack that as a community if we're going to move forward. And to do that honestly, we don't want to just say, well, let's just expand the canon and throw everybody in there just because there's people of color. I'm not saying that. But really finding people of color who are actually engaged with this great conversation so that we can see that it really was for and about all of us. And we have to do that and share the space of leadership, share the space where decisions are made in this movement so that people of color, because I'm not kidding, I get emails now from people of color who say, I see that conference hardly has any Black people speaking, hardly any. They can see. We think that even though you may have an urban education path in your conference or in your organization, if they're not seeing Black and brown people a part of that journey, it's still communicating it is white supremacist. I hope that's okay to say.
I mean, that's always for me. I love this movement. I'm involved in these different things. I travel, I recruit for the Honors College at the Abbey, so much from classical school, and it's overwhelmingly, right? It's overwhelmingly, the students I'm encountering are white, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
for me, you know, I talk with you and Dr. Parham and I'm like, we're convinced, like, no, this is for everyone. The Du Bois line,
Yes.
and yet, right, like when if a colleague comes to me and says, well, like, look, isn't this sort of white colonization, right? I mean, not a colleague at the Abbey say this,
Yeah.
but yeah, like, look, what you're doing is this thing, and you say, well, no, it's not,
Yeah.
because, right? Listen to Dr. Prather, and they say, but look at the numbers, right? Look at the
So they're not being drawn. Like, even you and I have been having this conversation for 2 years. Overall, we've been a part of this movement for some years, right? I've been a part of this movement for 20-something years through my parents in 2000. They started the journey to start a classical school in 2000. It is 2023. And we still hardly have any schools that, or we still see, not schools, we still see a small number of people of color in this movement, celebrating this movement. And you can feel the reticence. I don't know. You can feel this struggle to figure out, how do we incorporate them? And I will tell you right now, people are very sensitive. You will not draw them if you don't bring them to the table.
Yeah.
If it's only, you're allowed to say this over here. You're allowed to come over here because we've already laid out the framework, and now you can come speak what we want you to say. That's not going to bring people of color.
No.
People of color will come when they feel like they are literally a part of the movement and its process forward. And the danger is that after, you don't want people of color to say, since they're not willing to be that open, we're going to start our own. And that's not good, because then we're back into these segregated efforts. And that's not, classical education is not supposed to be segregated. It is supposed to be a common ground to bring us together. How do we do that, honestly, in this very tense season that we're in? It's hard.
I wonder if this sort of, I don't know. I'm thinking through things here, but I mean, it seems like the natural ally in terms of making the cases, like the link can be Christianity. Not that you can't have classical Christianity or a classical education without Christianity, but like, I heard a really great talk on the Black church and its role in racial reconciliation, and I was wondering, is it sort of by turning back to Scripture, right, that you say, look, there's something that is old. There are these classic texts, not the Scriptures like any other classic text, but do you find that the most sort of progress you make in making the case to Black communities is through Christian churches, or is there resistance there even?
It's hard to change the world, but in our small little community of Protestants and Catholics who share a common love of Jesus Christ and believe in his death, burial, and resurrection, we've got to kind of figure out how we can come together with diverse voices around this tradition that we believe and organize something that truly shows a united effort that is not connected to political terms, that's not connected to different philosophies and ideologies that are out. The main framework is our common humanity, our common faith, and our common love for these books. And that we just have honest conversations together, and that together we are educating educators, teaching educators on how to do this in a way that draws. I think about the scripture that says, if I be lifted up, I will draw all men unto me. Like, how do we do this in a way that draws all men to this wellspring of truth, goodness, and beauty as a Christian community? Our color of our skin, Joseph, you and I, does not bind us together. It's the love of God, the love of Christ that connects us to one another. How do we use that as our root to have honest conversations about my true racist experiences, but yet I'm a part of this broader Christian community, and we can come together and and fix this in a way that is completely different. And I think classical education has it there. We just have to come around it together.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I am really looking forward to the getting into the difficult conversations, right? Because that's always we go to these classical conferences and everybody's on the same page, and we're trying to push the movement forward, and there's all the good parts. And now I want let's get to the next level. Like, how are we really going to figure this out together? And it's a challenge, but it's a great challenge. And I'm so grateful to you for being part of it.
Thank you.
We went way over time, but that's okay. Conversation was great. Thank you. And
thank you.
In signing off, I want to say thanks to all of our listeners. This has been the Conversatio podcast at Belmont Abbey. You can access this wherever you get your favorite podcasts, on Google and Apple. So thank you again, Dr. Prather, and we look forward to seeing you soon.
All right, take care. Thank you all.